you to this reception honoring Dr. Ruth Stanley Cavan. Many of you have had an opportunity to see her extensive vita, but for those of you who have not, Ruth Stanley Cavan received her PhD from the University of Chicago in sociology in 1926. And her affiliation with the University of Chicago continued until about the mid-1940s. Now this was the time, it's always a good time to be at the University of Chicago, but this was the time when the University of Chicago was in its height. And she was there first as a student and then as a research associate. Now from those particular days, she has published 4 books. One of them was Suicide, which was her PhD dissertation, and then 3 others were from research projects that she did as an associate. She has specialized in marriage and the family, in crime and delinquency, and also in the historical religious communes. And this is what her master's thesis was on isolated religious sects, and what she's doing right now currently is on communes. She is currently working on a paper called The Emergence of Charismatic Leaders in Religious Communes. Ruth is best known for her textbooks in criminology, delinquency, and the family. But she has also done a lot of other professional writing. She has several articles in the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review, which many of us are very envious of. And she also had an early article in the American Anthropologist. She has 2 articles in Social Forces and 1 in Sociological Quarterly. The one in Sociological Quarterly was her president's speech for the Midwest Sociological Society. She was the first woman to be elected president of that organization. She has received a lot of other honors from the American Sociological Association, the American Society of Criminology, the Illinois Academy of Criminology, the John Howard Association, which some of you may know is an association that works for reform in prisons. She also received honors from the Illinois Sociological Association and the Illinois Council on Marriage and the Family. I met Dr. Cavan in 1980 at the university, at Northern Illinois University. And I was very pleased to meet her because I felt like that I had known her in a way since the 1960s. Because when I was a student at Kansas State University and also at a college in Missouri, I used Dr. Cavan's criminology book and also her juvenile delinquency book as a student, as a text as a student. In there, she had a chapter on women and crime, and the delinquency, she had a chapter on juvenile girls. At that time, I tried to write a term paper and found that there was almost nothing. So I feel like through Ruth's influence and also through my master's thesis advisor, Dr. Joe Rogers, that they basically were influential in my research as a criminologist, which has been predominantly on women and crime. So I could go on, and Ruth has threatened me if I do, so I won't. But she's going to talk to us tonight on the development of sociology and criminology at the University of Chicago prior to about 1935. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ruth Stanley Cavan.
Thank you. I always feel a little overwhelmed when somebody starts all that rigmarole because, you know, it stretches out over some 60 years or so. If you divide it by 60, all that by 60, it doesn't come down to too much in any one year. But I have to forgive Imogene because she's such a good friend. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first, the development of the University of Chicago, because it had a kind of a unique beginning, and then a little bit about sociology there, and finally some about criminology, and one particular professor there who taught the courses and who did some very significant research. I was at the University of Chicago to finish my undergraduate work from January of 1920. I got the bachelor's degree in 21, the master's degree in 23, and the doctor's in 26. Then I continued there in and out of Chicago for quite a few years, carrying on research. Finally, I stopped going to Chicago so frequently. The early period of the University of Chicago is quite interesting. It's a private university, not a state university. And the Baptists in the East wanted to establish a large Baptist-oriented university in the Middle West. And it happened that a Baptist theological seminary had a charter from Illinois, and they had gone broke. So there was a charter for a theological seminary, and this group that wanted the university took that over. And what remains of that is the Divinity School, which is one little segment now of the University of Chicago. And around that, they built a great university, many different departments. Well, when I was there, it was still very religiously oriented. We had to go to chapel, and we didn't like it. This was in the 20s. So we protested in a quiet way, polite way. We didn't make any, commotion or have any sit-ins or any of the riotous stuff the students do now. But we would read during the chapel service. We would sit there and we'd read. We obviously were paying no attention. Well, a year or two afterwards, they abandoned that. They saw it was just a farce, and they gave up on that. But the president for a long time had to be a Baptist. And finally, there was one man they wanted for president who was not a Baptist. He changed his church membership from whatever it was to the Baptist. And I think they gave up on that. And then a certain percentage of the board had to be Baptists. Well, they've moved away from that Baptist orientation as time has gone on into just a liberal kind of a university. But that religious slant carried over into sociology. And the sociology department at Chicago, which was organized along with the university in 1892, was the very first department of sociology in this country, and I suppose in the world. There had been courses given before in other universities, but no department. So when this department was started, it had to define what its field was. And of course, there were no really professional sociologists to take it over. So the men and they were all men, who organized the sociology department came from other fields. Some were ministerial background, English background, but all with some interest and maybe a little training in sociology. And this idea of social reform hung over it for quite a few years. But Albion W. Small, who had been called to organize the department, always had an interest in turning it into a research-oriented department with objective studies. And so gradually it drew away from the social reform, the let's make good religious students out of these kids, into an objective approach. And when I was there in the 20s, it was really in this transition period to becoming an objective, research-oriented department. And that is one reason, I think, why it was a really great time to be there. There are two outstanding things that happened in the late, the years just before 1920 and in the 1920s that were landmarks. And one was the publication of the 5 volumes of The Polish Peasant in Europe and America. I don't know whether any of you have heard of that now or not. Of course, it's old, but still good. William I. Thomas and a Polish scholar named Zanicki, Florian Zanicki, combined to make this study. And they got all sorts of material in Poland, letters, all sorts of documents. And of course, the Polish man, Zanicki, could translate them. And Thomas could add the sociological approach, 5 volumes. Well, those were just sacred to us. We never questioned a thing in those volumes. And then Park and Burgess, 2 of the professors at the University of Chicago, got out a comprehensive textbook called this Introduction to the Science of Sociology. And it set a pattern for sociology textbooks for years to come. And these were 2 outstanding things that were current at the time that I was there. And we were sure that those were the last words in sociology. Now, there were 4 outstanding professors in sociology in the 20s. One was Albion W. Small, who had headed the department from the beginning. He had ministerial background training, and he also had studied in Germany. He was president of Colby College, and they lured him away from there to start a sociology department at the University of Chicago. He was also dean of the graduate school. I remember him very well. I discovered I was broke, I might say, all the time, as most of the graduate students were. And I discovered somewhere in the catalog that the dean, which he was of the graduate school, could remit the tuition for a worthy but indigent student. Well, I was indigent, certainly, and I decided I was worthy. So I went to see him. And he was a rather small man with very intense blue eyes. And he sat there and he looked at me, why did I want to study sociology, and so on and so on. Then he said he had that right, but he had never remitted tuition for a student in sociology because he didn't want anyone to think he favored people in his own department. So I went away, trying to think, well, now where am I going to get the money for that? And the next day or 2, I got a notice from the university saying the tuition was remitted. But I've always been exceedingly grateful to him for that little boost for me when I was just starting my graduate work. Well, I took a course with him, and then in 1925 he had to retire. He had a very bad heart condition that had developed, and he retired. He died a few years later from that. But I had the chance to meet him and to have one course with him. And he was the one that set the pathway toward getting away from social reform and getting into a real research type of sociology. He also started the American Journal of Sociology and was the editor for a long time. And he was instrumental in getting the American Sociological Association started. So his influence extended beyond the university, and he really was a founder in many ways. Now, another one was Robert E. Park. Now, Park was quite a character. He had studied in Germany. At that time, if a scholar was really a scholar, he studied in Germany. I didn't study in Germany, I might say. But he had, and he had been at one time a journalist. Then for years, he had traveled with Booker T. Washington as Booker T. Washington's secretary and companion. And he had a great interest in interracial relations from that. But then somehow or other, he got to be a professor in sociology at the University of Chicago. He was very, very popular. His classes were very interesting, and one thing he told me, he said, get out of the library, get out in the city and see what life is like. So we did. And we were mostly, middle-class people from middle-class towns. So what we got out in the city to see was the slums. And so we made a great practice of seeing what life was like in the ghettos and slums of Chicago. And for quite a long time, every Sunday, another graduate student and I went by streetcar to some area of the city where there were immigrants. And this was the time when many immigrants were pouring into Chicago. And we just prowl around to see what we could see. And we saw some of the most interesting celebrations, things of that sort, just by doing that. And I might say that for 2 students to go and have no expense except the streetcar fare was the cheapest kind of date you could have. And that's what they were. So we did many things that were interesting and inexpensive, but very revealing. Now, Park was always throwing out ideas, and graduate students were snapping them up and doing their doctor's dissertations on them. Park himself didn't do a great deal of writing. He would write the introduction, maybe, or something like that to the dissertation, and a good many of those were published. But he himself did not produce a great deal of research. And his special field of interest was the city, urban problems, and these community problems, and the integration of ethnic and racial groups. Now, another one was Ernest W. Burgess. He had a PhD from the University of Chicago, and he came there on the faculty in 1919. He was at first a kind of an understudy to Park. He was much younger than Park. They shared an office. And they together wrote this first really remarkable textbook on sociology. And I understand that Park provided a lot of the ideas and the framework. Burgess did a lot of the library work, digging out material that could be reprinted and used in the textbook. Well, Burgess was a prodigious worker, a very well organized sort of person. He later developed fields of interest of his own, especially first in the family and then in criminology. And I'll speak a little later about his relationship to criminology there. But he was always looking for projects to be developed, and he was always learning. I remember that a course, the first course, I guess, given on the campus about Freud, he took it. And we didn't have any statistics in the department at that time. When finally some statistics arrived, real statistics, he took the course. So he was always learning as he went along and always developing and carrying out research. I did a lot of research with him after I had the PhD. And then the fourth one was Ellsworth Ferris. Now, Ferris was a very different type of person. He had a PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago. Well, they wanted somebody to teach social psychology in the sociology department, so they got Ferris to come into sociology. And he taught what was then social psychology. It was mainly a study of personality, one sort and another. Now, I was, for several years, the assistant to Ferris, and I did both my master's thesis and my doctorate dissertation with him as advisor. So I had very close associations with him all the time. Now, he was a critic. He found it very difficult to write, very easy to talk, and to give papers and talk to students. He was very much opposed to instincts. Now, the psychologists at that time at Chicago were still using instincts and instinct theory to account for human behavior. And the sociologists were thumbs down on instincts. We had all taken over Thomas's 4 wishes. I don't know whether you know Thomas's 4 wishes, but we accepted them without question. I'm trying to remember what those 4 wishes were. A wish for a response, a wish for recognition, a wish for security. I can't remember the 4th one.
Is it excitement?
I don't know. Can't remember what it was. But anyway, those have gone by the board, too, by this time, But at that time, and they were in opposition, in theory, you see, in opposition to these set instincts, where there's something happened and you automatically responded. So that was really his field. I found him a very interesting person to be associated with. And I took Park's courses, Burgess's courses. There weren't as many given then as now. We took them all. Everybody took all the courses, and then we did independent work outside, and we hung around as long as we could. Some graduate students, they really shoved out. They said, "You've been here long enough. Get out now and get a job." Well, it was comfortable there. There were only 60 graduate students, and we knew each other well, and we knew the professors, and it was a kind of a primary group or primary community, People didn't want to leave. Now, some contributions from the University of Chicago, I thought, were interesting. In the Park and Burgess textbook, they developed a series of social processes. The groups went through a period of conflict, then competition, then accommodation, and then assimilation. Then finally somebody tucked in acculturation between accommodation and assimilation, but that was not in the original book. Now, Park was interested in the Oriental groups in California, and he thought they'd follow this pattern, but he found out they didn't assimilate. So his little series of theoretical steps did not hold out there. And of course, that now you don't have that assimilation put in. You have matters of integration. The theory has changed. But they started it off in a way. And a lot of the others are still very good in theory. Then another one was the pattern of urban communities. I don't know whether you are any more familiar with Burgess's concentric circles in cities, where you start with a business center, then the area of transition, which is the ghetto, and then lower class, middle class, and out in the suburbs, upper class. And you get that if you go out certain lines, for sometimes the suburbs are not. But theoretically, that was a new thing. And students then made studies of something or other, especially there were many studies of delinquency in Chicago and other cities, tracing the rates of delinquency from the center, or not so much the business center, but the area of transition, the ghetto, out. And the rates went down, 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 down. Then you had to explain why. Why were the rates high in the ghetto? And so there was one easy one, well, they were foreigners and blah, blah, blah. It's because they came from this and that country. But of course, that wasn't true at all. It was because of their lack of integration into American society. And that finally came out. So these things led to whole trains of research that threw light on human behavior. And then now more about Burgess and the criminology. Burgess taught the only courses in criminology that were given at that time in sociology. He had a course in criminology, another one in delinquency, and one called social pathology, which was really a course on deviancy. So those three. So I took them. Everybody took them. Now, for the delinquency course, you had delinquency when there was poverty, when there was this, when there was that. He traced out what the factors were in each individual case that made that particular child delinquent, and then suggestions as to what could be done. They were marvelous case studies, and Burgess used those as the basic material in his course on delinquency. And Burgess was very much interested in a case study approach, where you really studied what went on in an individual's life that made him behave in one way or another. And that itself was a good contribution. And Burgess was also instrumental in a series of books from the Institute for Juvenile Research, where the whole book was on a particular case. And much of it was material that the delinquent himself had written. It was called The Boy's Own Story. And they would entice some delinquent who was fairly verbal, to either write or dictate his own experiences in becoming a delinquent. And there were 4 of those. They're very rare now, I guess, 3 of those. One was called The Jack Roller. The Jack Roller was a delinquent boy who went out and knocked over a drunk on Skid Row and robbed him. And another was The Natural History of a Delinquent Career, in which the whole life history of a delinquent was traced through. And the third one was called Brothers in Crime, and that was one in which several brothers in the same family became delinquent, and their little brothers trailed around after the older ones and took on the delinquent pattern, just the way they might have copied anything else that an older brother did. Well, these are marvelous books. I happen to have each of the 3. I'm going to watch you when you come to visit me next time. Now, Burgess would write introductions to those, or he would write an interpretation. And he was the one that stimulated them. They actually were prepared by Clifford Shaw and some associates, one of whom was Henry McKay. Well, they are no longer, alive. And then Burgess did a very significant piece of research that was applied. There was always a question when prisoners came up for parole, whether they should be paroled or not. Would they just go out and break the parole right away and have to get back in prison? Or would they live up to the conditions of parole and turn out successfully? So he devised a system for measuring that. He got from the court or prison records all the facts that he could on the background of an individual prisoner and made a scale for a number of prisoners, then classified those prisoners, these are ones already on parole, I guess, as to whether they had failed on parole or were successful. And so he found out then if they had a certain number of factors in their background, they had a certain degree of chance for success. And he had a table, They had so many factors in their background, good family life, had been employed, had education, all that kind of thing. Then they had a high percentage of success on parole. If they had none of those things, then they had a very low chance for success on parole. And the parole board used that in considering whether or not to parole prisoners. I don't know whether they do now or not. I think they need a new scale by this time, because conditions have changed. But it was actually used for a time. And then Clifford Shaw also made an application from these studies of delinquents in setting up certain types of programs in the ghettos, which presumably would help prevent the boys from getting into delinquent patterns. So there were those applications of practical research onto what was done, I suppose policy applications of what was done. And these were part of Burgess's contribution. He was a very dynamic, compact little man, never married, very close to his family. He had a sister who never married. After their parents died, the two of them are, still kept their home. But his main interest was in sociology, the research. He did a lot of research on marriage, and he also devised a scale to indicate when you were engaged what your chances were of a good, successful marriage. On the same type of thing, as to your background. So I enjoyed my associations with him very much, and I carried out several research projects. The one on the family and the depression, one on social adjustment in old age. Was there another one?
Yeah, the other one was on children.
Oh, yes, the
White House
study of adolescent children for one of the White House conferences. I did the research on those three projects under his guidance, Well, I guess that's it.
Okay. We thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to also thank Dr. Robert Muchnick for videotaping this.